Hi everyone, and welcome to Hauntora. If you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button. This is the place where we explore the darkest, most deeply unsettling, true horror stories the internet has to offer. And if you've been here before, welcome back. Genuinely glad you're here. Here's something I've never admitted on this channel before. There are stories I find, read once, and never open again. Not because they're bad, because something about them feels like a door. And once you've seen what's on the other side, you can't unsee it. I have two of those tonight. 2 doors, and I've been standing in front of them for weeks, trying to decide if I should be the one to open them for you. I decided yes, but I want you to understand what that means before we start. Everything you need is at the top of the description. It'll be there when this is over. 2 stories tonight, and the way they're ordered matters. The first one is going to make you uncomfortable in a way you can identify, put a name to, maybe even rationalize away. Good. Let it. Because the second story doesn't give you that luxury. No rationalization, no clean exit. Just something that happened that nobody has ever been able to explain and that has lived in my head rent-free since the night I first found it at 1 a.m, wishing I hadn't. I want your reaction in the comments the second it ends. Raw, unfiltered first thought. Don't think about it. Just type. I'll be there reading every single one. Lights off. Phone face down. This one deserves your full attention. Viewer discretion is advised. My Uncle Ray used to say that the measure of a man was who showed up at his funeral. By that standard, my godfather was an exceptional man. Packed house, standing room only, people crying who barely knew him, a minister who called him a pillar, a mayor who shook hands over the casket like it was a campaign stop. I stood at the back and watched all of it and didn't feel anything I could name cleanly. That was 4 years ago. I'm still not sure what to call what I feel now. I'm not someone who builds narratives around gut feelings. I'm an electrician. I've been licensed for 11 years, run my own crew for the last 5. My job is literally diagnosing systems, finding where the break is, following the circuit back to where the current stopped. I say this because I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is not something I wanted to believe. I resisted it at every step. I built alternative explanations the way I build panels, methodically, one component at a time. And then the alternative explanation stopped holding load. His name was Gordon. He wasn't my actual godfather in any religious sense. My family wasn't church people. It was more of an honorary thing, a title that stuck, because he'd been my father's closest friend since they were teenagers. And when my father died of a cardiac event when I was 6, Gordon stepped in without being asked. He showed up at the house the week after the funeral with groceries. He kept showing up. By the time I was 8, he was at every birthday, every school play, every awkward parent-teacher conference where my mother needed someone sitting next to her who looked like he knew what he was doing. I loved him the way kids love the adults who make them feel safe, completely, without audit. He had a piece of land in the mountain region, a few hours drive from where we lived, up into the kind of country where the roads go from 2 lanes to 1 lane to gravel to something you can't really call a road at all. The property sat on the edge of a reservoir, and there was a small island maybe a 1/4 mile offshore that he'd acquired separately, some private sale decades before I was born. He called it the camp. We went up maybe 3 or 4 times a year, just the 2 of us. And those trips were the fixed points of my childhood. Fishing, campfires, him teaching me to identify trees by their bark, to read weather by cloud formation, to navigate by watershed when you didn't have a compass. He was patient in a way my father, from what I knew of him, apparently hadn't been. I thought Gordon was the best man I knew. The island was where he kept most of the gear. Canoes, spare tackle, a generator, food stores, and a locked outbuilding he called the larder. We'd paddle over most mornings and spend the day there, come back to the mainland camp at night. Sometimes he'd go over alone in the evenings, said he liked to check the equipment, inventory the stores. I never questioned it. Why would I? The first time something felt wrong, I was 12. It was a July trip, midweek, no particular occasion. We'd had a good day, caught more fish than we could use, and Gordon had been in a loose, easy mood, the kind that made everything feel uncomplicated. After dinner, he paddled out to the island alone like usual. I was supposed to be asleep. I wasn't. I was lying in my sleeping bag, reading with a flashlight, doing what 12-year-olds do. I heard something carry across the water. Sound moves strangely on still water at night, compresses and extends in ways that are hard to account for. So I told myself I wasn't sure what I heard. I told myself it was an animal. There were foxes in that area, and foxes in distress make a sound that can register as human to an unprepared ear. I'd read that somewhere. I filed it under that and went back to my book. But I'd put the book face down and I wasn't reading anymore. I was listening. It came again. Longer this time. A sound that moved through registers in a way that animal distress sounds don't. And underneath it, barely audible, something lower. Not a voice, more like a door or a mechanism. Then nothing. Water. Wind in the pines. Nothing. Gordon came back 40 minutes later. I pretended to be asleep. I heard him moving around outside, washing his hands at the pump for longer than usual. I lay still and kept my breathing even and told myself I'd imagined the shape of what I'd heard, that I was a kid alone in the dark in the woods, and my brain was doing what brains do. In the morning, he was completely normal, made breakfast, talked about where we'd fish, and I let it go the way you let things go at 12, when the alternative explanation is something you don't have the architecture to process yet. I was 15 the second time. September trip that year, just the two of us as always. Gordon had been quieter than usual on the drive up, distracted in a way that I noticed but didn't comment on, because teenage boys are not especially gifted at reading adult emotional states, and I assumed it was work stress. He'd had some kind of business dispute that my mother had mentioned in passing. I didn't know the details. We'd been on the island most of the afternoon, doing inventory in the outbuilding, when Gordon told me to start loading the canoe. We were heading back early. He didn't say why. I went around to the far side of the outbuilding to grab a tarp we'd left it staked out. And that's when I heard it. Not across water this time. 20 feet away. From inside the outbuilding, through the wall. A woman's voice. One word. Sharp and high, and cut off so fast I couldn't tell if I'd actually heard it or if I'd manufactured it from the ambient noise of the trees. One syllable. Could have been an animal. Could have been the generator cycling. Could have been anything. I walked back around to the front of the outbuilding. Gordon was standing in the doorway, looking at me. I don't know how to describe what his face was doing. In the years since, I've tried to find the right word for it, and I can't. It wasn't anger exactly. It was more like the expression of someone who has just made a calculation. Fast and cold and completely private. You ready? He said. Yeah, I said. We paddled back in silence, and for the first time in my life, sitting in the back of that canoe, watching his shoulders work the paddle, I was aware of the distance between us and the mainland, the specific fact of it, how far the shore was, how loud I'd have to be to reach it. We drove home the next morning, and he never mentioned the trip again. The trips to the island stopped after that. I told myself it was because I was getting older, getting busy with school, that it was natural. A few years later, I left for a trade program, 2 states over, and the relationship faded into holidays and occasional phone calls and eventually just birthday texts that he always answered, and I sometimes didn't. I didn't think about the island. I didn't let myself. The journalist contacted me 11 years later. Email first, then a phone call. She was working on an investigation. She was careful about how much she said up front. Said she was talking to people who'd had contact with a specific individual over a specific span of years. She mentioned Gordon's name. and I felt something happen in my chest that I can only describe as a rearrangement, like something that had been leaning against something else for a long time had finally been moved. She asked if I'd spent time with him at a property in the mountain region. I said yes. She asked about the island specifically. I asked her why. She paused before she answered. The kind of pause that means someone is deciding how much to give you. She told me that Gordon's name had surfaced in the financial records of an operation that authorities in 3 states had been building a case around for several years. She told me the island property had been flagged. She asked me if I'd ever seen or heard anything during my time there that, in retrospect, seemed inconsistent with what I'd understood those trips to be. I sat with that question for a long time before I answered. I told her about the sounds. Both of them. The night on the water when I was 12, and what I'd heard through that wall at 15. I told her about his face when he came around the corner and found me standing there. I told her all of it. The way you tell things that have been stored somewhere without light for a long time. Carefully, making sure I was describing what I actually remembered and not the version my brain had been quietly constructing around it for 20 years. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said she was going to pass my contact to the investigators. She said they'd be in touch. They were. I gave a formal statement, a long one. They were thorough and professional and gave almost nothing back, which is how those things work. The investigation is ongoing as far as I know. Gordon died before any charges were filed, a cardiac event, same as my father, as if the body has a limited vocabulary for how men like that exit. The case, whatever the case is, did not die with him. I've thought a lot about the version of him I grew up believing in, the man at the campfire teaching me to read clouds, the man who showed up with groceries the week after my father's funeral. I've thought about whether that man was real or whether he was just what Gordon needed a child to see. I think both can be true. I think that's the part that makes it hard to sleep. He knew I'd heard something that September afternoon. He looked right at me and he made a calculation, and he decided I wasn't a threat. He was right. For 20 years, he was right. And somewhere out there, there's a woman who made a sound through a wall, and I was 15 feet away, and I loaded a canoe and went home. That's the thing I'm still trying to find a place to put. I was 14. I want to say that up front, not as an excuse, but because it matters. The decisions you make at 14 feel like the most logical things in the world when you're making them. Nobody at 14 thinks they're being reckless. They think they're being brave. There's a version of me that's still out there somewhere, sitting in that boxcar with a granola bar and $32, genuinely convinced he'd figured something out. I hadn't figured anything out. My home situation at the time wasn't something I talked about much, and I'm not going to turn this into that kind of story. What I'll say is that the night I left, there'd been an argument, the kind that ends with a door slamming hard enough to rattle the frames on the wall. And I walked out with a backpack, a sleeping bag stuffed too full to zip properly, and the particular certainty that only a 14-year-old who's never actually been alone can feel. I was going to my uncle's place, 2 states over. I had a rough idea of the direction. I had no phone, because mine had been taken 2 weeks prior. The freight yard was 3 miles from where we lived, and I'd watched trains roll through that town my entire life. I knew which ones slowed on the eastern curve. I'd talked to a kid at school the year before who said he'd done it once, that it was easy, that you just waited for a car with an open door and grabbed the rail and pulled yourself up. He made it sound like nothing. He was also the kind of kid who lied constantly, which I knew and chose to ignore because I needed the information to be true. Got on a southbound freight around 10 p.m. on a Thursday in late October. The car I chose smelled like machine oil and something organic underneath it, something that had been sitting in the heat and then gone cold. I pulled the sleeping bag out, sat against the far wall, and watched the town I'd grown up in slide away through the gap in the door. For the first 2 hours it was fine. Cold, loud, uncomfortable in the specific way that makes you feel alive when you're 14 and running from something. The trees came up fast once we cleared the edge of town. Thick second growth, then older forest, the kind that swallows light. I ate the granola bar. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter. I told myself this was the right call. Somewhere around midnight, the train slowed. Not a stop, just a reduction in speed. The kind of mechanical deceleration that feels like the whole world pressing gently on the brakes. I looked out the door gap. Trees, rock face on one side, a drop on the other. And below that, nothing I could see, just the sound of water moving fast somewhere in the dark. We were in the mountains. Deeper in than I'd expected to be that quickly. The train slowed further, then stopped. I sat very still and listened. No station sounds, no machinery, no voices, just the metal cooling around me, ticking and contracting, and the water somewhere below. I told myself it was a signal hold. Trains stop for signals. That's a thing that happens. I'd be moving again in 10 minutes. I wasn't moving again in 10 minutes. After maybe 30 minutes of sitting in that stopped car, I heard voices outside, below the level of the car, like they were standing on the ground beside the track, low, unhurried. The kind of voices that belong to people who know exactly where they are and aren't worried about being heard. Through the door gap, I could see the edge of a platform, stone, old, covered in a layer of leaf matter and what looked like tarp material, the blue plastic kind, stretched between iron columns that had gone orange with rust. A station, or what used to be one. The structure behind it was mostly intact. A low building, boarded windows, the ghost of lettering above the door that had faded past reading. There were lights inside, not electric, fire or something close to it. The warm, inconsistent orange of something that flickers. 3 men. That's how many I counted before I stopped looking and pressed myself back against the wall. They were moving equipment, bags, containers, things in hard cases, from somewhere in the building to somewhere further down the platform, out of my sight line. Working. Systematic. Nobody talking much beyond short functional exchanges I couldn't make out. I should have stayed in the car. I know that. I know it now, and I half knew it then. But I was 14, and the sleeping bag was making a sound every time I shifted, and I'd convinced myself that if I was going to be sitting still for however long this was going to take, I needed to know what I was sitting still next to. I don't fully know why I got out of the car. Fear, probably, working in the wrong direction the way it does when you're young, pushing you toward the thing instead of away from it. I dropped down to the platform on the far side of the train, away from the building, and crouched in the shadow of the undercarriage. That's when one of them came around the back of the last car. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me. Big man, work jacket. The kind of stillness that isn't calm so much as it is the absence of any reason to hurry. He looked at me the way you'd look at a door that had been left open, with mild irritation and the intention to deal with it. "Get up," he said. I got up. What happened next, I'm going to move through fast. Not because I can't remember it, but because the details aren't the part that matters. They put me in the tunnel. That's the only way I know to describe it. There was a section of old rail tunnel cut into the rock face behind the station, sealed at one end with a rusted gate, open at the other end where it went deeper into the mountain and turned dark. They put me in the open section near the gate, zip-tied my wrists to a pipe that ran along the wall at shoulder height, left a lantern on the ground about 10 feet away. Not for benefit, I understood later, but because total darkness in a tunnel does something to a person's head that makes them loud and difficult. I was not loud. I was very quiet. I sat on the ground, with my arms above me, and I thought about every decision I'd made in the last 6 hours with a clarity that was almost funny. The cold in there was different from outside cold. It came up through the rock, through the ground, through the wall, against my back. It had weight to it. It pressed. I don't know how long I was in there before she came. A woman. Older? I'd have said 40s maybe, though I wasn't good at ages then. She came from the deeper end of the tunnel, which told me something I didn't want to think too hard about, which was that she'd been further in, that there was a further in. She moved without a light, which meant she either knew the tunnel well enough or had been in the dark long enough that her eyes had adjusted to something mine hadn't. She crouched down in front of me and put her finger to her lips. She had a multi-tool, worked the zip ties without a word. When my hands came free, the circulation coming back hurt bad enough that I made a sound, and she put her hand flat on my shoulder and held it there until I was quiet again. She knew the layout. She knew which direction the men were, which gaps in the platform were blind spots, which section of fence at the far end of the rail yard had enough give to push through. She moved like someone who'd been planning this for longer than one night. I didn't ask. She didn't explain. We got through the fence and into the tree line, and she pointed uphill and said 2 words, "Keep going." I looked back once. She wasn't behind me. I moved uphill for what felt like 2 hours, probably less. When the trees thinned, I found a logging road, and the logging road eventually met a state route, and I followed the state route east with my thumb out at every set of headlights, until a woman in a station wagon with a child's car seat in the back pulled over and asked if I was all right. I said no. She drove me to a gas station with a phone. I called the only number I'd memorized. My aunt answered on the second ring. I told her where I was. She drove 4 hours to come get me. The state police took a report. They sent people to the area I described, or close to it, as close as I could get them with no GPS and a 14-year-old's memory of a route he'd traveled in the dark. They found the station. They found evidence of recent occupation. They found the gate into the tunnel. They didn't find anyone. They asked about the woman. I described her as best I could. They ran it. Nothing came back that matched. No missing persons, no known associates of anyone connected to the site. Nothing. A detective told me, in the careful tone adults use when they're choosing their words around a kid, that it was possible she'd been there against her will as well. That my getting out might have created an opportunity for her too. He said it like he believed it. I wasn't sure he did. My uncle picked me up from my aunt's place a week later. We didn't talk much on the drive. At one point, he asked if I was okay. I said, yeah. He nodded and kept his eyes on the road. I've thought about her a lot over the years. The way she moved through that tunnel without light. How she knew exactly where to put the fence so I could push through. Those aren't things you figure out in one night. Whatever she was doing in there before she found me, I never asked.